For many Africans, Senegal is seen as a focus of hope. It's widely recognised for its stability and democracy and is seen as a real model to follow. Yet, it's one of the poorest countries in Africa, struggling to find its place in an economic revolution that is sweeping across much of the continent. To talk about that and more, I'm with the President of Senegal, Macky Sall. Thank you for joining us on Global Conversation.
It's a pleasure.
We hear lots about Africa's rising economic growth, and yet there are still huge issues of instability, inequality and poverty. How can this paradox be overcome?
Africa is a vast continent with many different situations. You've got more than 800 million people living here with a really young population. We have lots of natural resources, which are sometimes badly managed, and there are sometimes problems with democracy, so that doesn't paint a good picture. But at the same time, you also need to understand that there's an Africa which is growing and emerging, a democratic Africa, where there are elections that take place without any problems. That's the case in Senegal and in other countries as well. Increasingly, things are going really well across the continent. We're seeing growth based on well-managed natural resources and, above all, a transformation of raw materials in the continent.
If you could pass on a message about Senegal, what would it be?
Senegal is a model which needs to be supported and nurtured. It's an island of stability in a problematic region. A model of democracy and tolerance and of stability like this deserves the support of the international community. Senegal is not a big country. It is just 186,000 square kilometres.
Excuse me, how do you play a part in this economic revolution if you don't have the natural resources that other African countries do?
First of all, it's essential to understand that it's not natural resources which make a country developed. You can see plenty of examples of countries with huge amounts of natural resources with absolutely no development. And equally, you can see countries, particularly the Asian tiger economies, which are proof that a country can become developed without natural resources.
Do you have a model country in mind?
Yes, Korea is one example. Also, Japan, and even a country like Rwanda, which is even smaller than Senegal. It's heading in the right direction, and I think Senegal is going the same way. We have some natural resources. We don't have any gold or oil, but we have phosphate and we have iron, which we're going to make the most of. But above all, we have high-quality human resources, and that is irreplaceable for any country. We've got problems with poverty, like most countries in the world, and particularly poverty among young people, because unemployment affects young people more.
Excuse me, does it worry you that, as in many African countries, unemployment and poverty drive young people towards extremist groups?
Yes, there's a risk. There's a risk that poverty could drive people to extremism, that's clear. But our role as leaders is to create conditions that mitigate the effects of unemployment and to create more jobs for the young in our country. Obviously, it's not a simple issue, as even developed countries still have these problems. You can go to any developed country today, and the problem of unemployment is there. But the role of leaders is to put in place solutions so that young people don't fall into the hands of extremists or end up at the bottom of the ocean or in Lampedusa. Our role is to keep them here with economically viable projects which work as solutions to the scourge that is youth unemployment.
If we stay with this question of instability, we asked our viewers and social media followers to send in their questions. And we received one question about the Casamance region, asking how the security situation is there. Because, of course, you've worked hard on that since becoming president.
First of all, the security situation in Casamance is going very well. and it's something to be really pleased about. Thank God there haven't been problems, and hardly even any crime. People waited for a signal, and I think the signal that has been sent to the rebellion has been a positive one. The rebels have responded in keeping with this, and we are using mediators to start a dialogue for peace. After 2 years of conflict, it is time to talk about peace, because this is a conflict among fellow countrymen and women. And whatever the situation, we must be able, through dialogue, to find a definitive and lasting peace in Casamance. So, I work with the different factions in a way that they see as best for them. The only thing I've said is that as long as national sovereignty is not compromised, everything else is negotiable. I won't negotiate on Senegal's sovereignty.
And you share a long and porous border with Mali. Do you worry that there'll be a resurgence of extremism, given that the Tuareg leadership recently threatened more violence?
You know the threats. We see them, we hear them every day. Our role is to make sure we have good security along our borders to protect our population, whatever the situation. These threats don't call into question the fundamental work of defence and security that our teams do daily. I don't think we are in a situation where there is the risk that you mention.
Looking further afield to the Central African Republic, where a bloody civil war is happening, and to interim President Catherine Samba-Panza, do you think she'll be able to end the conflict there?
It's going to be very difficult, but I hope she will be given the support of the international community and the means to end it. Unfortunately, at the beginning we didn't do anything, and now we see that a religious conflict has become a civil war. I am very satisfied with the intervention by French forces in Operation Sangaris because it has stopped the worst from happening. Otherwise, we would probably be talking today about a genocide with hundreds of thousands dead. When you see hatred being played out like this, you have to stop the unthinkable from happening. Now I think the European Union has decided to mobilise its troops. Anyway, it will be a very good thing if the EU comes to support French efforts and the African forces, AFISMA. I think it's vital. With a deployment like that, of course, the deaths would stop and the situation return to normal.
Well, that brings me to a question we received from Joseph Enduma, who asks, do you think Africa is capable of managing the crisis in the Central African Republic by itself, or does it need international intervention?
Absolutely. The intervention is needed. As you know, a military deployment is very expensive. Africa already has big problems to solve in everyday life. It has to look after the health of its populations. At the moment, the focus is on fighting Ebola. We need efforts from the international community to work on research for a vaccination. We've sent Senegalese volunteers, doctors from the Pasteur Institute, and virology professors to see what they can do. I hope that with international aid, we can do even more. Africa has to cope with its diseases, its development, its job situation, its unemployment. To then come up with the means for a defence force, I don't think that we can do everything. When it's a minor conflict, Africans don't expect any help. But when it's a civil war, when it's a huge area in which to deploy planes, helicopters and tanks to, a military operation of this type costs around €1 million a day. So, obviously, without the support of the international community and the United Nations, it's not possible. It's not that Africans don't have the physical capacity or that they're not brave enough. No, it's a question of budget.
France has a presence in Africa at the moment, and I think that's triggered the next question. Freddy Vitel Kalonga asks you, are you for or against the continuity of Nicolas Sarkozy's French Africa by François Hollande?
First of all, these kinds of concepts are outdated. French Africa doesn't exist. What does exist is that France had a historic role in Africa, but that is also history. France has continued to have these links. It can't disengage from them. If France hadn't intervened in Mali, what would have happened? And if it hadn't intervened in the Central African Republic, there would have been a genocide. We should encourage that, and we should congratulate France. I think the EU should support France's efforts because Europe has a responsibility for Africa.
Are you disappointed by the EU's attitude?
It's a poor attitude. Europe has a duty of solidarity vis-à-vis Africa as a continent that was colonized by Europe and as a neighboring continent of Europe. When there are difficulties, we can't say the Africans will have to manage on their own, we're putting up the barricades. No, it doesn't match Europe's historic role.
When you mention the EU, do you think there's a double standard going on? Because the EU is very interested in Africa on an economic level, but do you think they do enough on a social level?
No, you can't say that they don't do enough to support us. That's not what I mean. Particularly when you think about the amount of foreign aid, the EU is the biggest source of help in the world. Their economic aid should be praised. What I'm talking about is their military and security plans, which haven't risen to the challenge. When it's to do with Afghanistan or elsewhere, they intervene alongside the Americans. But when it's Africa, they don't intervene. There's no logic to it.
And when it comes to immigration?
I'm not calling for the borders to be opened completely, but this approach, which says we're going to close our borders, that we will bring in Frontex, that we are going to use satellite surveillance on people coming by boat, that's definitely not the best attitude. People are going to move around whatever conditions are in place. It's human nature. And migration has always happened historically. Europe needs to work with the countries of origin, the countries where the immigrants come from, to see what are the best means for collaborating and cooperating, especially looking at development, so that these countries can keep their young people. We should keep these human resources, train them, and show them how they can contribute to the development of the continent.
Returning to Senegal, you're going to be holding a special tribunal to try Hissène Habré, who's accused of crimes against humanity. This is a real first. Is it a new model for justice in Africa?
Our country decided, at the request of the African Union, to put Hissène Habré on trial in our country and to refuse his extradition to Belgium. I said that I couldn't extradite an African to a European country. However, I was against impunity, and I decided to hold the trial in our country with our jurisdiction under the mandate of the African Union. At the prosecution's request, he was arrested and placed in custody, and the investigation is going on now. I think as soon as they've finished, that a trial will be set for Mr. Habré.
And do you think this is a new model of justice? Because there are lots of Africans, the African Union too, who aren't really behind the International Criminal Court and see it as run by Western racists and imperialists.
It's not normal that the ICC always focuses on African cases. You can't tell us that there's no crime in Central Europe or even in Western Europe or elsewhere. The United States isn't a member. China isn't a member. Russia isn't a member. So at least the Africans accepted, in the main, to be a member of the ICC. When cases come up, what Senegal has said is that you still need to look at what happened recently in Kenya. You still have to stop and reflect. Can you come to an independent country with a president elected by the people and take the president and his vice president and send them to The Hague? What would Kenya become in all of that? You can't behead Kenya in the name of international justice. Yes to international criminal justice. Yes to equal treatment for all cases in all continents.
But you don't think there's equality? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying there's no equality, but I'm saying that when things like this happen, you can think that there is a double standard.
Well, we don't have much more time, so moving on quickly to women's rights in Senegal. And you've really pushed for equality in politics. Do you think Senegal and lots of other countries who have female leaders could teach Europe something?
We do have something to teach Europe in terms of law and equality. I don't know any European country which has reached the same level in advancing women in the arena of politics, and the equality law in Senegal requires every electoral list to respect the equality principle. We have local elections coming up soon, and this principle will be applied across the country.
Exact equality?
Perfect equality. Perfect equality.
We mentioned at the beginning of the interview that China, the US, France and Great Britain are fighting out an economic war in Africa. Do you think that Africa will benefit?
In Africa's interests, we should think about a new partnership. Europe benefited from the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. Africa today needs investment. Investment rather than aid. We don't have money, but we do have resources. We can repay the money if the credit terms are fair ones. It's about finding a new way of financing that isn't the one created 30 years ago by the Bretton Woods Institution. It needs to evolve. We've seen that international development aid hasn't allowed development in Africa. So we need to find new ways and work together to establish the rules of the game. Chinese, Europeans, Americans and Africans. Europeans have expertise in infrastructure and in railways. The Chinese have the money. And the Africans offer an African platform with their markets, growth and employment. So the whole world can gain from this win-win strategy.
Well, let's finish quickly with a question we've received through social media, which brings us back to Senegal. Dieudonné Fernandinho Mbabu asks, what do you think of Senegalese people? Do you think that everything's going well? And if you were in their place, what would you ask the leaders of Senegal?
First of all, I want to pay tribute to the people of Senegal, because they are very tolerant. It's a country which has experience, which has had democracy, which is patient and tolerant, where you have a majority of Muslims living in peace and harmony with their Christian brothers. With a people like this, all I can do is serve them with everything I have and try to always deserve their confidence.
President, thank you very much for being with us.